to say. I feel the same way about myself. And, overarching goal of his research program is to try and understand the neural computations that inform and support visual perception. I think he's distinguished, his training is in computer science, and he got a journal in both computer science and the cognitive linguistics and psychological sciences at Brown. And I think he's really distinguished in that he's a computer scientist that really understands the visual system, both in humans and in other animals. And he brings that knowledge to bear in developing sophisticated computer vision models, how we see. So without further ado, let's welcome Thomas.
This is my first time here, so I'm delighted to. I think there are a few places where I have so many old friends and new ones, so I think it's really great. In terms of the audience, I should have asked that earlier, but this is a vision seminar, so broad.
Going to be mixed.
Mixed. Okay. So I'll do my best. Feel free to interrupt. As usual, I have way too many slides, and so I'm not going to cover everything. So feel free to interrupt. I'd rather spend more time on things that are relevant to this group rather than covering necessarily everything. All right, so let me start with a little demo, and I should point out that this is probably my very favorite experimental paradigm. The resolution is a little off, so I don't know how things will play, but I'm going to play a movie here, and that's going to be an example of the so-called rapid visual categorization type of experimental paradigm. The idea is very simple. I'm flashing images very briefly. Here it's going to be about 100 milliseconds. In the lab, you could flash those images for 5 milliseconds or so. You can force, so you can ask human subjects, to press a button depending on, or another, depending on whether you see a particular class of objects in those images, for instance, whether there's an animal or not. And you can force behavioral decisions to be very fast, well under 500 milliseconds. It's tedious, subjects hate you for that, but they can do it. And so the reason I think this is such an interesting task is because, when we think about our visual system, we have 3 dozen or so visual areas. Those areas are almost always reciprocally connected. When you think about the dynamics of vision, the dynamics can be quite complex in the general sense. And so these types of experimental paradigms have long been used as a gateway to try to simplify as much as possible the underlying dynamics of vision. And so the assumption here is that while certainly those tasks do not reflect natural everyday vision, when we are able to move our eyes, shift our attention, those types of tasks are sufficient to enable us to study what I would call the building blocks of vision, or what we call the base visual representations, before complex visual routines like attention, eye movements, and things of that sort come into play. So at that speed, probably you didn't see every details in those images, but most of you should be able to identify the main category of an object being presented. And just as a side note, this is not just humans. I won't show you the movie to spare some time, but as you would expect, monkey are very good models of vision. We can train monkey to reliably discriminate between those natural images at very fast speeds, and they can generalize to completely novel images. So, so as you would expect, those are good models of vision. All right. Yeah.
How high can you go in the frequency to perform?
Yeah, so I should have pointed out. So there's I put under the same kind of general umbrella a number of tasks that you might have heard, you might have known from Muddy Potter's work in the 70s and Herb Biederman, rapid visual serial presentation. So there, I think typically they would go at 10 hertz. There are different versions of those. For instance, there's a slightly more modern version introduced by Thorpe in the 90s, where they were just having single trials, after which people have to press 1 or 2 possible buttons. And there you can go all the way down to 5 milliseconds. I mean, literally, you're mostly limited by the hardware. And then you can add a backward mask. I mean, there are different versions of those tasks, but I would say, if you squint your eyes, I think what those tasks really highlight is what is possible when the visual system is kind of constrained to operate at its temporal limits. And so the expectation is that, so what do we know about the underlying brain mechanisms? I would argue that we know quite a bit. In particular, we know that much of our abilities to process visual information, recognize the category of objects being presented is largely due to a set of areas known as the ventral stream of visual cortex, area V1 sitting at the back of your head, running through a hierarchy of visual area from V1 to V2 to V4, somewhat culminating in the IT cortex. We, in collaboration with monkey electrophysiologists and many other people, some of them are probably even in the room, have shown that you can actually, from electrode penetrations, from neural recordings, one can decode the category of the stimulus being presented to the animal very rapidly, within about 90 to 100 milliseconds. And so these kinds of very fast neural selectivity has been taken as evidence that this rapid visual processing is probably predominantly driven by feedforward processes. That is, we know that in the visual system, there are both feedforward bottom-up connections and top-down feedback connections. But the assumption is that when we force the visual system to operate at its temporal limits, much of the computations can be approximated by a single sweep, feedforward sweep of activity through the ventral stream of the visual cortex. Just as a little bit of a parenthesis, if you look more closely at those estimates, obviously they will vary depending on the experimental setup, but the rule of thumb is that within about 100 milliseconds, there's enough signal in the visual system to categorize an image and suddenly decide whether an animal was present or not. So if you do a back of the envelope type of calculation, 10 milliseconds roughly per synapse suggests that, so I would say 10 to 20 milliseconds per synapse, whatever computation is happening within 100 milliseconds probably reflects somewhere around, maybe half a dozen or so processing stages or synapses. Okay. So I'll get back to that estimate. Keep that in a side of your brain. And so, starting decades ago, there's been a lot of work aimed at trying to model those kinds of very fast feedforward visual processes. So some of you might have heard about class of so-called feedforward hierarchical neural networks. I did my PhD in the laboratory of Tomi Poggio at MIT, where people were working on this HMAX model. This was a big component of my PhD thesis, but of course there are many other models. And I would say, it doesn't really matter. Well, I would say that the detailed, precise differences between those models are not super important. I think the most interesting results from this whole line of work on feedforward hierarchical neural networks is that a lot of the tuning of neurons in the ventral stream of the visual cortex, I'm realizing that I'm turning my back to half of the room, much of the tuning, selectivity, invariances of neurons in the ventral stream can be well accounted by those models. And the main ingredients, the main computations underlying these models is really just 4 operations that are being cascaded, where we have a hierarchy of visual processing stages, and within each of those processing stages, 4 key mechanisms are needed: filtering, nonlinear rectification, division normalization, and pooling. And if you approximate those 4 operations and stack them into layers, one on top of each other, we and others have shown that it's possible to account for, a fair amount of the existing anatomical and physiological study. And most importantly, going back to my original rapid categorization task, we have shown that if we look at the pattern of correct and incorrect responses for both monkeys and humans, by simulating those models, we were able to account for a big chunk of the explainable variance in the data. So to me, as a computational neuroscientist, until a few years ago, things were quite exciting. We had models that were able to be constrained by anatomical and physiological data. When running those models, we're able to account for a high-level visual recognition task like this rapid visual categorization experimental paradigms. And so this was a way to somewhat link monkey electrophysiology all the way to human behavior. So we had kind of a nice story, and this was a validation of this so-called feedforward hypothesis that when the visual system is forced to operate at its temporal limit, much of the processing can be well approximated by a feedforward sweep of activity. Now, fast forward a decade or so later, as most of you know, we're in the midst of the small AI revolution, so-called deep learning revolution. And if you squint at your eyes and look at what's new with the new generation of artificial neural networks beyond these old feedforward hierarchical models, it turns out that there's a lot that they share, that there's a lot that they have in common. For one thing, if you look at the modern version of those hierarchical feedforward neural networks, with the convolutional neural networks, all of these neural networks share the same basic 4 operations that I alluded to earlier: filtering, pooling, divisive normalization, and rectification. The key difference between older models of biology and the new deep neural network is really a matter of scale, that we have access to a lot more data. We're talking, several orders of magnitude more data, more compute, several orders. And so these neural networks are now humongous. They have a lot more parameters. They are trained on a lot more data using a lot more compute. And if we look at, what has been, what I think is one of the main ingredients or engine that has been driving the progress in the field in AI and computer vision, there's this diagram that I really like that summarizes what has been happening in one of the main type of visual challenges we had in computer vision. So this challenge, you might have heard about ILSVRC. It's a challenge that used the ImageNet dataset, which I'm sure everybody has heard about. It's about 1.2 million images, 1,000 object categories. And so, the challenge was introduced in 2010, ran until 2016, which was the last year that the challenge was held. And so the first year when an artificial neural network was, so every year people submit, they run their architecture, we evaluate performance, accuracy. And so the first year where an artificial neural network won was 2012. This was the year where AlexNet was introduced. So the way to read this plot is that there are blue bars. The height of the bar give you a measure of the error rate of the winning architecture for that year. So everybody submits, and then there's a winner. That year was AlexNet with an an error rate of 16%. And so, you see the trend year after year, all the way since 2010, the error rate of the winning system has gone down. And I would argue that one of the main engine of that progress in accuracy has been, so you can see it here on the red plot, red curve, which is the number of layers, the depths of the winning architecture for that year. And so you see that in 2012, when we go back to AlexNet, we had something not too far off from visual system. I mentioned, somewhere around half a dozen, maybe up to a dozen processing stages. But year after year, we've gotten towards, deeper and deeper neural network. By 2016, the winning architecture had well over, 200 processing stages. Okay. And so I'll refer to that as the brute force solution that computer vision and AI have discovered. We are really going, and the trends have been continuing. My plot ends in 2016, but by now we have truly humongous, language and vision models. So, in all fairness, I think the progress has been amazing. I would say well beyond what much or most of us computer vision scientists would have expected to see. When we look at 2 of the main computer vision challenges, we have natural object categorization is one, facial recognition is another one. Many of my colleagues in computer vision would argue that these 2 challenges are largely solved, that we have computer vision systems that can achieve human level, both for the categorization, recognition of natural image categories, and facial recognition. And yet, as much as I think there are reasons to be excited, and I don't want to dismiss the major gains that the field has made, I think there is an incredibly or a growing literature that is starting to demonstrate that the way those very deep, very large-scale artificial neural networks are seeing and processing visual images differ substantially from the way we primates and humans process images. So here's an example, which I love, which I took from a very old review article from Pavancina from Nature Neuroscience. The example is starting to get old because I think as the people in the audience are getting younger and younger, they are less they are less likely to know those people. And also, I should point out that the quality of the projector is pretty bad. But if you know these people, actually, I'm not gonna look at anybody in particular, but you know, people who are at least my age, I think you can probably recognize. Reagan, right?
George.
I think this is Nixon. Anyway, you can. Anyway, the point is that if you know these people, then chances are you'd be able to recognize those faces. And what is important here is that you would be able to recognize those faces, even though you have never experienced this particular image degradation, right? So I think it's fair to say that none of you have seen a face that was stretched vertically, quite like those. And yet, your visual system seems to be able to somewhat undo the image degradation and recognize the people behind. I'm not going to show you results, but a few years ago, I had, when the first papers came out demonstrating that deep neural networks were able to achieve human level of accuracy in facial recognition, some of the students in one of my classes took one of the state-of-the-art system and then just casually, some of the systems are actually trained to recognize famous people, so we could establish that they could recognize, regular versions of those faces, and then as soon as you apply a transformation that they were not trained for, their accuracy falls apart. And, there's been work done, not by my lab. This is the group of Matthias Bedger in Germany, who has shown that a little bit more formally. They run a type of rapid visual categorization experiment, like I showed you earlier. They took a subset of 16 classes from this ImageNet data set. They evaluated people doing rapid visual categorization, evaluated the representative deep neural network when trained and tested on ImageNet, and they find that when the baseline is human rapid visual categorization, the systems outperform humans. It's not like those systems are fragile in the sense that you can actually add a very significant amount of noise to images when you train them. And if you do that, they are still going to outperform humans during tests. So they can really tolerate a large amount of noise. It's not that they are, feeble or anything of that sort. But here's the dirty little secret. Now, if you make a tiny little change between the type of noise applied during training and tests, and I know that given the poor resolution of the screen, you probably don't, the differences are there, but they are minimal, but this is the difference between salt and pepper and Gaussian noise. Then you go from systems that are at superhuman level of accuracy down to systems that are at chance level. So those systems are able to learn and almost memorize patterns of noise applied to their training data set, but they are not able to generalize to what would be otherwise very similarly looking types of noises applied to images. So the argument that I'm going to be making here is that it's really much more about this artificial neural network learning to solve data sets or challenges over feeding to particular kinds of noise, as opposed to solving visual tasks in the way that we humans and primates would. Here's briefly another example. This is work actually done by my group, where a few years ago, there was a whole literature on visual question answering, where new computer vision system architecture powered by deep neural networks were starting to demonstrate capabilities, again, approaching human level, where you could show complex visual scene and ask those artificial neural network, questions about the visual scene. What's above the green square, or what's inside the box, or what's how many of the same objects are there in the image, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we were a bit skeptical of this impressive accuracy, and so we went back to a very simplified version of some of those basic visual question answering tasks. We printed down to the simplest of what we could think of, which is the same different task. Every cognitive scientist, psychologist here in the room is probably familiar with those kinds of tasks. I show you two shapes, and you have to say, I give you maybe some positive, some negative examples. And you have to figure out the rule. And here the rule would be maybe both shapes are the same or they are different. But the key here is that we realize that all the deep neural network exhibiting those impressive cognitive reasoning abilities, visual reasoning abilities, were always trained and tested on different stimuli, but the different stimuli always involve the same small finite set of colors and shapes. So in other words, there was a possibility that this neural network would just learn statistical associations between visual features and class label without the need to really abstract beyond the visual appearance of the objects. So just to demonstrate this, my student went back to standard data sets for testing this kind of visual question answering. We just took pairs of shapes. The networks were trained for discriminating between same and different. And here we took all combinations of shapes and colors for training except one. So for instance, the architecture here has seen some cyan things, and it has seen some squarish things, but it has never seen a cyan square, okay, which is used for tests. And then you can take the state-of-the-art system, or what was at the time, a few years ago, state-of-the-art. If you wait long enough, you can actually get perfect training accuracy. By the way, here we stopped before at the end, but notice that we're talking about 500,000 training examples just to get to about 90% accuracy. But in our experiments, we systematically, whenever even though we could feed the training data, we could never get the system to generalize to the single left out combinations of color and shape. So again, suggesting that this neural network really just, learn mapping from visual appearance to class label without really understanding the abstract rule, which in this case would be same different. And the point that we are trying to make here is really that, it's not like you need big brains to solve these kinds of tasks. There was a paper published just a few years ago in Science by Martino III and Kalsenik that showed that they could imprint newborn duckling. So at birth, they just wiggle pairs of shapes, very much, like 3D printed versions of those, pairs of balls or cubes and things of that sort. And from a single training examples, they showed that, just by imprinting, they could get the duckling to generalize in a 2 alternative force choice beyond, the exact visual appearance of the training data. So they could generalize over color or over shape. So from one single training examples, the newborn ducklings are able to learn or discover an abstract rule such as same different in a way that those convolutional neural networks are not able to get even after hundreds of thousands of training examples. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that there is something missing in those Feedforward neural networks. I'll skip this. This is just to make the point that there was some follow-up work. I often get the complaints, oh, things are getting better now. We have bigger networks trained with more data. Well, again, there was a paper published just 2 years ago that showed that the prime is still there. There is still complete overfitting of this training of these learning architectures on the data sets. So just to summarize this very lengthy introduction, I tried to make a couple of points. One is that feedforward neural networks, such as convolutional neural networks, transformers, etc., have become orders of magnitude deeper than our own visual system. Obviously, going beyond rapid visual categorization task, we can give subjects more time to respond beyond the fastest they can, which would be this 450 millisecond. But as we give people more time to answer, obviously they're gonna, as they slow themselves down, they're gonna get more accurate. Our assumption is that the way we are getting more accurate by slowing down our behavioral decisions is by building depth, not statically, like in a very deep feedforward neural network, by having more and more and more processing stages, but presumably more dynamically by leveraging feedback connections that are present in our visual system. And I'll try to, in the remaining of my talk, try to convince you that this is, perhaps one of the key ingredients that allows us to reach those kinds of human-like or primate-like abstractions beyond just template matching or statistical associations between input and output. Okay, so I already know that I'm going to run out of time. Okay, so but before I get into the weeds, I just want to introduce a few definitions. So I've already used a little bit those terms before, but all right, so I'm going to be talking about, so feedforward connections will be connections running from lower processing stages onto higher processing stages. I'm also going to be talking about top-down feedback connections running from a higher level of processing onto lower processing stages. And then horizontal connections will be connections running within a processing stage, for instance, linking neurons with, for instance, within nearby cortical columns or nearby receptor fields. So top-down, running from top to bottom, recurrent horizontal or lateral connections would be running within a processing stage. Okay, so we wanted to build models of and better understand the role of cortical feedback for visual processing. And so as our starting point a few years ago was trying to build a model of so-called extra-classical receptive fields. So I don't know how many of you have heard the term extra-classical receptive fields before. Yes, so I know that all of you know at least about the classical receptive field, right? Which is think of that as the the pinhole through which neurons see the world, right? So I need to stimulate the classical receptive field or the receptor field to be able to elicit a response from the neuron. The extra-classical receptive field, by definition, sits outside of the classical receptive field. So if I stimulate the extra-classical receptive field, and only the extra-classical receptive field, I'm not going to get much response from the neuron. And again, that's by definition. Otherwise, it would be considered part of the classical receptive field. However, if I already present something in the classical receptive field, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of experiments that have shown that and characterize the kind of very complex interactions between this extra-classical and classical receptive field image regions, whereby what I put in the extra-classical receptive field can have a very strong impact on the actual neural response. So there's as I mentioned, a lot of data that has been observed. You can present all kinds of centers around stimuli, and then people have observed and measured all kinds of very complex interactions between those things. Sorry. And so our model, I'm not going to go through the detail of the model. I'll just try to give you a hand-wavy explanation or intuition for how this model works. But the gist of this is that we are modeling processing into one cortical area. As I'm sure you all know, cortical areas are organized, at least in the visual cortex, with cortical columns, right? Or hypercolumns. So each one of those columns will incorporate a battery of neural responses, neural selectivities. So neurons spanning an entire range of selectivities. So for instance, all possible orientation tuning in the orientation domain, all possible color opponency in the color domain, same thing with motion, disparity, and so on and so forth. So we have these hypercolumns containing the same basic dictionary of visual selectivities, and those things kind of get replicated across our entire visual field, whereby two nearby columns will correspond to neurons with receptive fields that are encoding nearby location in the visual world. All right, so our assumption was that, and that of many others, was that those classical extra-classical interactions correspond to or are a byproduct of connections that are existing both within those hypercolumns, between neurons with the same preferred receptive field location spanning different selectivities, but also interactions between neurons and those at nearby locations within nearby cortical columns. So the gist of this model is that we're going to try to build a model of those interactions, and we can effectively think of this as what we call a tensor of synaptic weights. And so here in this model, we have populations of excitatory and inhibitory cells. Neurons at one particular XY location and position in terms of K, which would be, think of that as the orientation tuning, for instance. The response of this neuron gets modulated by a whole surrounding set of neurons. And we have both inhibitory and excitatory connections. And then, we are using a classical kind of dynamical system type of model to try to take into account those horizontal connections. Again, I won't say much about those equations, except that they are relatively standard in the field. Again, the most interesting thing here is to think of how to wire, how to select the kind of inhibition and excitation both within and across cortical columns, so that when neurons get, or these like responses get integrated by populations of excitatory and inhibitory neurons, we would be able to account for all this electrophysiology that we are trying to model. And so the way to do this was classically through so-called graduate student descent, right? So I had a graduate student spending about a year or two of his life trying to tweak all the parameters in this model. So to figure out how to set the inhibition, the excitation everywhere, and in order to account for the electrophysiology. And he was able to do that. He was a very smart and brilliant graduate student. And what he discovered in the making of this model was that we needed 3 key ingredients in the model to be able to account for the electrophysiology. We had to assume that the pattern of connectivity between, that there was 2 surrounding regions among these cortical columns. So if I'm a reference column here, remember that I'm trying to figure out how to wire to my neighbors. And so we found that we needed excitations from nearby columns and inhibition from faraway columns. We also found that the pattern of connectivity between neurons across columns or spatial location was of the tuned kind, which means that only neurons with the same selectivity have to connect to each other. So if I'm a reference column here, I'm going to connect to my neighbor here, if and only if we share the same selectivity. And if we're nearby, our interactions will be primarily excitatory. If I move further out, again, we're going to be connected if and only if we share the same selectivity. But now the pattern of connectivity reverses, where much of the interaction ends up being inhibitory. And then we also had to bake in some kind of nonlinear inhibition, but I'll spare you those details. Yeah.
Are those 2, just to make sure I'm understanding, are those 2 opponents around regions, both external to the classical?
Right. So sorry. Right. So here in this case, the classical receptor field would be 1 center cortical columns, and think of that as nearby other columns, and then so near and far. Yeah. Yeah.
And so here, the properties that you're defining does not take into account anything about feedback. It is purely just lateral.
You're absolutely right. So in this model is only a model of yes,
Yeah.
or at least the first version of the model was just recurrent connections. For much of the electrophysiology, it doesn't really matter if you have top-down feedback or not. But in practice, I'll show you some experiments where we have extensions of those mechanisms to incorporate both horizontal and top-down connections.
Yes.
And the same ideas apply. Yes.
And just, I'm curious, you said you needed these ingredients to account for the
physiology. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's a physiological study you could point to that produced evidence on its own.
Yes.
Upper function.
This one. So actually, I'll say that this was a speculation at the time, based on figuring out a pattern of connectivity. Since then, there has been study published evidence of this in the mouse visual cortex, where they use optogenetics, where they stimulated nearby, and they found that exactly that nearby columns were primarily connected through excitation, and that the polarity of the connections flips around after some critical distance. Yeah.
So I guess then you also define the far inhibition, then that would yield the feedback connection, because the
so you're right. If you look at the detail, I'm going very fast because I don't have too much time, but you're right. In general here, we're assuming that those horizontal connections, most likely, there's work by Angelucci suggesting that this far inhibition is more likely to be top down. Again, in the specific, the model is, we said the level of modeling, it wouldn't make much of a difference whether it's top down or horizontal, as long as you have feedback from, greater extent of the cortex. But those are very good points. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So just to give you so we were interested in linking this model constrained by the neurophysiology to a lot of experimental work on so-called contextual illusions. And I'll show you a few examples of those. But I just want to show you and give you a sense for why this circuit behaves in kind of interesting and hard to predict ways, right? So here's an example of the kinds of interactions we are seeing. So let's say that we are putting a stimulus, say a vertical grading in the classical receptor field, and then we put a grading that is tilted away from vertical in the surround. So here the center sees vertical, and then both the near and far surround see something like tilted here to the right. Okay. Let's assume that we are sticking an electrode in the model and we're recording from an entire neural population in the center here and in the far surround. So this is a idealized neural population response where, the different bars correspond to, so neurons, they have different orientation. Let's assume that this is the vertical orientation. So we have this kind of Gaussian-like tuning or response from the neural population that's peaking at the vertical orientation. But then let's keep in mind that when we also excite the surround with something that is tilted away from the vertical here, we can also elicit a distinct pattern of activity in the surround. And now because we have strong nonlinear inhibition from this far surround to the center, you can think of every one of those neuron pushing down the response of the center neurons, because this is the driving direction here of the interaction. And because of the nonlinear nature of the inhibition, the higher the activity here in the center for a fixed amount of input inhibition, the lower or the greater the effect of the inhibition on the neural response. So you have to imagine that those guys, they have tuned connections, they're going to push those guys down. But of course, the higher the peak here, the more down is going to be pushed. And so you should imagine that in effect, you're going to have a shift of that center response towards the left. So here's an example of that. So here we are flashing, sorry, I should have, I'm going to show you, this is the actual simulation from the model. We have center populations in red, surround populations in blue. We're just presenting the stimulus. I think the dashed lines were the initial responses for the beginning of the simulations, and then we have these complex interactions between center and surround. And so now you see some nonlinear interactions between the center and the surround. And so if you let this, after a bit, the circuit kind of settles in, but you see that the effect is that the center population now is shifted to the left, right? We started here, now we are here. And so if you train an idealized and optimal linear decoder on those center population, typically you would find that the decoded orientation now is tilted and to the left compared to the ground truth vertical. So that's an example and at least an explanation of one type of. Let's go. Okay. One kind of illusions known as the tilt illusion that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Those illusions typically depend on a lot of factors, including the spatial frequency, so the viewing distance. I don't know if it's going to work for you on this one, but when the angle between the center and the surround is small, typically the surround end up repelling the center, and so you should see a little tilt to the left. Those are typically a few degrees. And then as we increase the angle between the center and the surround, the effect decreases past a critical point where the effect actually reverses. And so typically the surround starts attracting the center. I'm not going to show you the details, but those are the kind of experiments that the model is able to account based on different kind of interactions based on what we put in the center and the surround, and based on whether the near excitatory or the far inhibitory contributions kind of win on a kind of case-by-case basis. And we have the same model is also able to account for all kinds of color illusions, including, this is an example of color contrast, where, we have the same color patch here, but depending on the surround, you're going to perceive different hues. And that's kind of fun. One, you're asking me about evidence for the near excitatory and far inhibitory surround. So this is psychophysics that we can explain with the model. I don't know, again, how well it works for you. On my computer screen, it's very flagrant, very obvious, but here, this is the same color. In fact, I don't know if it works for you. It doesn't work for me at that distance, but when the effect works, you should perceive a big difference in color here. And the surround in both cases are very similar. It's both lime and purple kind of surround, but the ordering is reversed. So here we're going from salmon to lime to purple, and here from salmon to purple to lime. Just that small change is able to have a big impact on the perceived color. And that's because in one case, the excitation from the near surround and the inhibition from the far surround, either they cancel each other because they are working in opposite direction, or they join forces and push, kind of double the amount in the opposite direction. I know that everything that I'm saying is kind of and wavy, but the point is that we were able to find that, many illusions spanning motion, disparity, color, orientation, etc., can be accounted by the same model. And the whole idea behind is that depending on the specific experimental setup, the center near excitatory, far inhibitory surrounds get different kinds of stimuli, and that in turn is going to yield to different types of interactions between the center and the surround. So this is a taxonomy that the model is able to account for. All right. Okay, so that's all good. This is published. I'm happy to get into the detail of this if anybody's interested. But I think this is interesting. We have a model that can link neurophysiology all the way to behavior with those visual illusions, but there's something a little kind of unsettling about the approach, right? So effectively, we're spending a lot of energy building a neural circuit model that effectively is a bug, right? So I'm showing you that you can worry about wiring all these cortical columns in a specific way, and then if you do this, then you get a circuit that explains why sometimes even though we are presented with a vertical grading, we see it tilted right or left, which appears to be potentially a bug. Of course, we didn't think this was a bug, but the issue with the kind of what I would call the traditional computational neuroscience approach, where we tweak the model by hand in order to account for electrophysiology, does not tell us very much about why the visual system would be wired this way. And the reason we're doing things by hand is because traditionally we had this continuous time systems of differential equations. And one thing that I didn't say here is that we get, two both excitatory and inhibitory units for every unit in every cortical column. So when we had to simulate those models, we would have to go through, and solve hundreds of thousands of differential equations, which is not really amenable to any kind of, optimization. But luckily for us, we're in the midst of the deep learning revolution. And so people have been working on kind of discrete time approximations of some of those. And so we can literally take some of the modern deep learning based recurrent neural network units and use those units to actually approximate very closely the underlying differential equations. And if we do this, then we open up the black box or the toolbox of deep learning methods. And now we have access to differentiable systems, and we can now optimize all the parameters of the model based on an arbitrary objective function. So this objective function could be figuring out the optimal set of parameters to solve for instance orientation discrimination task or contour detection or anything we can specify and train for. And so that's pretty much what we've done over the past few years. We've really kind of started from this basic neural circuit model, finding a deep learning approximation of a little module that would now allow us to approximate both the connectivity between nearby neurons within a processing stage, as well as top-down neurons from higher to lower processing stages. I'm not going to have time to go over much of the details, but maybe if I can show you a couple of key results in the last 5 minutes or so that I have. So here's one example of what happened when we train. So we take a feedforward neural network, 3 layers, and then we allow this network to learn horizontal connections and top-down connections. And we train that circuit on that model on the Berkeley segmentation data set, where there is human ground truth for all the kind of the semantic contours in the scene. So here you see an example of images there. This is kind of the ground truth label derived from human observers. So a couple of things that I should say with this data set, it's a little saturated, but so far there was already feedforward model achieving human level of accuracy for the detection of semantic contours. So all we could show was, or all we could get was same level of accuracy, which is human level. Remember that these models are trained based on annotation, so we cannot outperform humans in a sense, because that's what's used to train them. So both a feedforward and a feedback system are able to achieve human level. What is interesting is that we find that if we reduce the amount of training data needed for training the feedforward and the feedback model, the feedback model, which is this gamma net here, fares much better with less data. So you see that here, for instance, the system can do as well as the Feedforward model with 1/10 of the training data. And then in terms of the solution that is discovered by the network, it's very different from what the Feedforward neural network would discover. So here you see that, so this is the output of the recurrent neural network or the feedback model over time. So you see that at t = 1, the very first time step, the model is able, sorry, I should switch to the model is able to make a first guess about the location of possible contours. And then over time, the model seems to be doing what you would expect, which is to refine this initial prediction. It starts filling in missing contours and then suppressing the background, which correspond to non kind of object contours. And then at the final time step, you get something that looks relatively close to what humans would produce. We can evaluate the model for the tilt illusion. I'm not going to have time to go over the detail of this experiment. Just look on the left side. This is the human data. Remember that there's two sides of there's an attraction and a repulsion based on the angle between the center and the surround. I'll just ask you to eyeball qualitatively the feedback models exhibit those two kind of attraction and repulsion. After we train it to detect contours, you don't get that from the Feedforward model. Even though both of those models achieve human level of accuracy, it looks as if you do need feedback to be able to account for this and exhibit this sensitivity to the tilt illusion. We can use tricks to try to correct for the tilt illusion in the model. I'll spare you the detail, but we find that if we do this, we can remove the bias in the model by optimizing it and correcting for the illusion. And we find that when we do this, the accuracy for contour detection goes down. And we find that the model starts detecting kind of spurious edges, for instance, edges corresponding to the texture of objects. So it looks like you need two things essentially, at least from this experiments, to account for the tilt illusion. It looks like you need feedback and you need to optimize for contour detection. And if we try to correct for the illusion, then we get a significant decrease in accuracy. All right.
You tried building in a lack of the tilt illusion into the objective function in the training process,
So
as opposed to correcting the final thing after the fact.
I don't know how you do this. So what we are doing here, we optimize for, so we literally measure the ability of the model to detect contours, and then you get what you get, right? And so part of it, we get, a bias in the circuit that, seems to create this illusion. The only thing we can do with the fine tuning is that we say, okay, let's try to change the fine tune the circuit so that it detects, when we train it to decode the orientation, it reports the ground truth orientation, as opposed to, the default, which would be the tilted one. When we do this, we can actually predict perfectly the orientation, but then, you observe a drop in the ability of the model to now detect contour. So it looks like this, the tilt illusion is not a bug. Yeah, it's probably a feature of a system that is optimized for, solving, more naturalistic or ecologically valid tasks. And so when we tested with an edge case, like, this weird stimuli, the system is non-optimal, but is, otherwise pretty good in natural sense. Okay, I'll take 5 more minutes, I promise, just to give you a kind of a cool demonstration of what this circuit can do now compared to state-of-the-art system. So this is a task we borrowed from Peter Roselman. We turn that into a computer vision task. So we call that the Pathfinder. So here the task is such that, you should see contours made of paddles. We have a positive and a negative set. You should see 2 markers. On the positive set, the 2 markers fall on the same contour. On the negative set, they fall on different contours. So, and think of that as is there a path going from point A to point B between the 2 markers, or following kind of footsteps in the snow. And here, because we can generate, near infinite number of stimuli, we generated 20 million stimuli. And so the reason we did this is because remember that so-called, so modern artificial neural network are so-called universal approximator, which means that you can train them to solve any arbitrary mapping between input and output. So there is no task that a multilayer perceptron, for instance, cannot learn. I'll repeat that. I can take random images, completely random class label. This neural network will be able to learn the mapping. Now, the caveat is that it comes in the limit of an infinite number of hidden units and training examples. So the challenge here is to learn within, with a finite size network and a finite number of training examples. But here, I'm not going to try to make a statement about what feedforward neural network can learn and not learn. We know that they, we're going to give them 20 million training examples so that they can learn that task. But the claim that I would like to bring to your attention here is that they're going to learn to solve the task, but in a very inefficient way. And so here's the rationale. So here we're going to be controlling for the size of the contours. So we're making the contour longer and longer with size 6, 9, 14. And so the expectation here is that for a feedforward neural network to be able to solve the task, it would have to, at some point, have a receptive field that encompasses the contours and the two markers. It's the only way you know that there's a path between the two. We know that feedforward neural network, like convolutional neural network, grow receptive fields through depth. That's the pooling mechanism. And so if you have a fixed pooling size, you need more depth. And so our prediction was that if we look at the minimum depth, right, of a feedforward architecture, that we'll be able to solve these different versions of the task. As we make the contour longer and longer, it should take a deeper and deeper neural network. That makes sense? Okay. In comparison here, I'm going to just take the bare bone recurrent neural network possible, just one single layer of horizontal connections. That recurrent neural network can, in theory, because it learns local connectivity with the neighbors, it can, in principle, learn to associate things that are very far apart in an image. Because if I start from the one end of the image, right, I can send information to my neighbor, which can send information to his neighbor, and so on and so forth. And so in this way, if I allow for enough time, right, I'm going to be able to spread activation from one end of the visual field all the way to the other end. And so the prediction is that if I have a recurrent network motif like I described, a single layer should be sufficient to learn the task perfectly. So I don't have time to go through the details, but that's pretty much what we found. So this plot is essentially making that point. Irrespective of the path lengths, what we call edge group, which is our horizontal recurrent neural network model, can solve all versions of the task perfectly. When we go to even modern kind of recurrent neural network like ResNets, we find that, for instance, for the longer class, we need to go all the way to 152 layers of processing. So when you replot those data on two axes here, where we have 3 parameter multiplier here, from 1 to 1,000, accuracy on the y-axis, you think that you see that our horizontal circuit is in the sweet spot. It's the most parameter efficient and it achieves perfect accuracy. You can get the same thing again. We have 20 million training examples here. You can achieve the same level of accuracy of a feedforward neural network. You're going to need to go 3 orders of magnitude more parameters, which in practice, I'm not going to show you here, translate to a far greater number of training examples needed to learn the task. Okay, so I'm out of time. Just as a, if you know about transformers, this is actually not our work, but a group at DeepMind actually has integrated our pathfinder here, which is actually called PathX, into a battery of tasks that has been used to evaluate kind of state-of-the-art transformer networks. These are the networks powering your favorite ChatGPT and whatnot. They find that on the longer version of the Pathfinder, which is this PathX, they just couldn't train any transformer, even with 20 million training examples. And so, there is, something to be said about, kind of biology here, kind of providing a good solution. All right, so I think I'm going to skip much of the rest, fortunately, and just go to the conclusion. All right, so I've introduced, I hope, a new breed of feedback networks, which are inspired by cortical circuits found in the visual cortex. I've shown you that the tilt illusion and others that I don't have time to go over can be explained as a byproduct of neural circuits that are there to help biological visual systems achieve, both robust and efficient perception. Robust because we have examples of tasks where we are better able to generalize to novel stimuli out of distribution. More efficient because we can learn as well with far fewer training examples. I haven't had time to show you that, but in practice, we've been able to start from take leading feedforward neural network. I should have pointed out that all the state of the art in computer vision is all feedforward neural network, but with our neural circuit module, which is deep learning and differentiable, we can just take that module and shove it into our favorite kind of deep feedforward neural network. And we've been able to show that in all cases, we're able to increase the accuracy of these models when we add feedback to them. So we've shown that in the context of quantum detection, I showed you that, but also what we call panoptic or semantic segmentations, and we've also done some work on object tracking. So, I think I'm preaching the choir here, but the message, I guess, is that, there's still something for brain science to contribute to AI. And then just as a final piece of advertising, we are very interested in characterizing the visual representations, the visual strategies used by human observers when they categorize images. We have a game trying to do just that, where we're trying to identify what pixels, what visual features in images are actually driving human decisions during visual categorization. So it's called ClickMe. It's at clickme.clps.brown.edu. And so here the human players are playing with an AI system that's sitting on one of our server. The human starts with an image and a class label. The AI system starts from a blank screen. The human observers decide what part of the image to paint, which is going to get revealed to the neural network. And so the goal is for the neural network to recognize the category of the object as quickly as possible. Based on how the speed of recognition, people make points, and then you can, you appear on a leaderboard and you can make money. For us, this is a way to get at the level of figuring out where, over hundreds of subjects, where, what part of an image they think is most diagnostic about the category label. So anyway, if you're interested, please check this out, and I'll just give a big final thank to my lab members and the funding agencies. Thank you.
I'll let you field the question.
Yep.
The part of your sort of custom model that surprised me the most was the distal inhibitory connections were tuned. How central is that to the results?
Very important. Yeah. So we find that, so the paper as a whole, we did every possible lesion on the model. And I think the tuning aspect is quite important. It's not necessarily the most important, and don't ask me, this is old enough that I don't remember, but from memory, I think it's pretty important. And certainly I'm happy to send you, if you're interested can send you the paper and the supplementary information as a detailed list of all the lesions demonstrating what matters and not. I'm not sure it's useful for every single illusion though. So what we're really trying to do here was to build a model where you could apply without any change to the color domain, the orientation domain, disparity domain, and motion domain, which I didn't talk about.
And does that show up in your more recent models where they're learning?
Yeah, so the problem, we are looking into that, the problem with those deep neural network, especially on I think we're looking into that in the Berkeley data set. Certainly we're recovering the near excitation and the far inhibition. The tuning is tricky because there is, I think, a fair amount of what we call overfitting that's going on. The Berkeley segmentation data set ends up being pretty small. And so we have, even after training, we have quite a bit of noisy connection. So if I remember correctly, we find that there's a dominant, the dominant connections are like to like, but it's much noisier than what we have in the idealized kind of toy model. My guess is that, part of the issue right now, something that I didn't mention is that I think the limitation of this recurrent neural network and the fact that and the reason why they are not more popular in computer vision, they are really still a beast to train and simulate. So they are slow. They're going to be much slower than a feedforward neural network. So if you care about, training on the entire internet, that's a big issue. If you care about, reproducing the other biological data, that's a different one. Yeah, so my guess is that we are working trying to scale up those models. If we're able to train them on larger data sets, my guess is that we're going to see a lot of cleaning of the connections, and I hope we'll get closer to the idealized model. That's a very good question.
So how do you think about the difference between the behavior of, say, the classic deep neural net feedforward models and just how well they do on neural productivity measures? So like you take like Jim DiCarlo's model from this year on brain score, it does a really nice job of fitting various layers of the ventral pathway. Would you say that it's just fitting a feed forward path to the ventral pathway, or it's just, yeah, like, how do you?
I mean, if we're in between friends, right? So I don't really, I'm not a big fan of the brain score, and I think I think there could be many reasons why you fit better neural data. So I think it's an interesting measure, certainly. But I think there's a lot of reasons you might be fitting neural data better without necessarily being a model closer to the underlying. I'm much more interested in the kind of stuff that Michael has been doing on, having more refined kind of assessments of the local selectivity from neural population responses. And there we're starting to find, so we haven't looked at recurrent neural network models. We're working very hard on, it's been hard, as I was mentioning, to scale up to, if I want to convince my colleagues in computer vision, I need to train on ImageNet, at least it's not, this line on which is now, 500 million images. And so we are working on the engineering side to try to, scale those up. My guess, when we're able to train those models for image categorization, maybe we'll look at that, even though I said I'm not a big fan, I think, we may take a look, but yeah, I could give you afterwards, if you want, I have examples of cases where I can get a bad model to predict exactly as well as a good model, and yet we know that one is correct and the other one is incorrect. So I'm pretty skeptical with the brain score as the only measure. I think if it's in the service of testing a specific hypothesis of your model, maybe it's different.
So in the system of differential equation you have for the model, you have the weight matrix. Does this weight matrix stay the same across different layers?
Yes.
And if
Oh,
it's-
sorry. No, so everything gets trained. So when we have a single layer, then that's what it is. When we have multiple layers, then you train all the layers independently.
Yeah, but you still have the same pattern of connection based on the columnar organization, because basically my question is that as you go further down the visual hierarchy, let's say at area MSD, especially MSD dorsal, MSDD, you lose that retinotopic map. So you can't just really claim that a neuron that responds to 90-degree would the neighbor that responds at 90-degree, these two are connected. That kind of fades away.
Yeah, so we don't, so first of all, we haven't looked at emotion, and so I cannot,
Yeah, so let's say
that-
for IT.
but IT, there is actually, all ideas really, and there's still some retinotopy, but anyway, I agree with you, at some point you're gonna lose retinotopy, but we haven't looked at that, so I
Yeah,
don't
so
know.
what would be your prediction that how your model would do if you were to just mess around with that connection matrix in a sense and say, okay,
But the
layer
effect is-
one, layer two,
The earlier layers will potentially discover that, right? And so I think some of this, low-level interaction between nearby cortical columns and just around type of things will impact all the, have an impact all the way to the top, right? So.
Cool.
But then, yeah, telling you more, I just don't know what to expect in terms of, that would be interesting to look at it. But again, I think we really need to, and that's a big focus, is we need to be able to optimize those models on, I'm not sure about image categorization, but certainly something that will involve a lot more data than what we need.
Thanks.
I was curious about the problem that the network cannot learn like a cyan square if you haven't changed, trained it on squares, trained it on cyan, and can't combine these things. So you want to say a little bit about how we're going to solve that?
Yeah, so we have, so that's a little bit of, that was, not necessarily direct connection with the work we've done on the recurrent neural circuit.
Yeah.
But we did do some, we had a kind of a null model there, and showing that if you have just a toy model where you take the same CNN that are not able to learn the task, and instead of processing the entire image into one image channel, remember that I would call those models pre-attentive, right? They have no notion of objects. They have no way to prioritize processing. They have no memory, right? So all we did was to show that if you spoon feed those models with a representation that has been perceptually organized. And so the way we do this is that, say you have two objects, we just separate the two objects into two separate image channels, right? But are passed as input to the model. So presumably when you organize the scenes in this way, the model in theory knows that there is, or I'm going to anthropomorphize, but you see what I'm trying to say. The model has enough information to understand that there are two objects, and potentially to combine, to build representation of individual objects and then compare those representations. When we do this, the CNN can solve the task perfectly with a handful of training examples. So what do you need to organize a visual scene like this perceptually? You need, I think, attention. And then, for the comparison, you need working memory. And so we ran an experiment with my collaborator, Rufin van Roelen in France, in Toulouse. We did a beautiful EEG experiment where, and indeed, so we spare you the details, but we have other tasks besides same different, like for instance, spatial reasoning, where you just have to figure out whether one shape is, or the two shapes are more horizontally or vertically aligned. So same exact stimuli, but that's a spatial reasoning. Those we know that CNNs can solve perfectly. So presumably you don't need any kind of attention or working memory to solve those tasks. So Rufin and his postdoc, Andrea, ran an EEG experiment, and we find that, I think we found an increase in the lower theta, I think, or beta. And then, oscillate frequency channels are not up to date. But anyway, the point is that what we found was evidence for at least whatever increase in the frequency was consistent with an increased demand for attention and working memory. I think we're probably better than they do. And so the point that I think working memory and attention are two other things that are lacking in convolutional neural network. And I think those are the kind of things that are going to require some feedback and the kind of recurrent circuits that have an ability to maintain some kind of memory state. Okay, that makes sense.
We just use this word attention.
Yeah.
In the context of like humans understanding things. And attention is also present in the large language models that were engineered by ChatGPT. I missed most of your lecture. I'm sorry about that. Is there any material in your lecture that maybe gets closer to?
So we have evidence that so you're right. So transformers have some attentional mechanism. So the evidence I have is that we have a very simple, shallow one-layer neural network that can solve a task perfectly. Where this is not our work. This is work done at Google DeepMind, where they tested a bunch of transformers on a bunch of tasks, but one of them is the same task as what I showed on the previous slide. Even with 20 million training examples, they were not able to train any of the modern transformers.
This is a column that repeats the word fail.
That's correct. So that means that they couldn't train the transformer.
Okay. Yeah.
So failed to train. And I think what this shows is that, there is attention in the transformer, but it's really a brute force where you have to learn connectivity between every pair of neurons
in the correct way.
As opposed to what we are doing in a way which is in some ways we are learning also we are learning to connect neurons, but this is done locally, consistent with the biology. And so that's one way, for instance, to cut down the number of parameters, which in turn in this case is likely to be one of the driving failure. I mean, one of the reasons why the transformers are failing to learn with 20 million training examples, just because they have too many parameters.
Well, they've gotten too loose. At GPT, you ask it a question sometimes, and it just spits out the wrong question. And you ask it again, hey, was that right? Can you give me a source for this? And then it's like, oh, actually, I was previously wrong. Now here's the new correct solution. But no, what you just said previously was the correct solution. And it's like, maybe these models have gotten too big. There's like the right way to optimize.
I don't know. I mean, I'm always careful about it. So, too many times have I predicted or claimed that, scaling is not going to bring you X or Y, and I've been proven wrong every single time. And so I think it's fair to say that, the modern systems like, the next GPT-5 and so on and so forth, they are at scales, both in terms of the size of the models and the amount of data used to train them, that I think, we're almost, they're becoming almost as complex as the brain itself. And so I don't want to be in a position where I have to make any prediction. I don't know. I think it's entirely possible that we're going to, solve vision just by training on the entire internet. But clearly it's not going to be something that is human-like, right? Or very unlikely that we, that approach, which is very different from, or at least the kind of visual diet we're using on those to train those models is so different from our own visual diet, both in the quality and the quantity, that I'm willing to bet that possibly the solution they'll discover is quite different from the solution that our visual system has discovers, or evolution has discovered for us. And so, yeah, I think it's gonna be a matter of whether your goal is to, make money for OpenAI or to understand the brain.
Balance.
And certainly have students going in both routes.
We should probably call that a day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Not the entire.
Hi. Oh, Josh, okay. You look familiar, but I couldn't put a name. How are you?
I know.
Yeah.
So it's all under.
Thank you. Thank you. So we should get.
Great, okay, yeah.
Not as a.
Yeah. 6 years ago? Once, with Gary Rosenberg. Yeah.
Okay.
That was a great. Yeah, it really is. Student monkey stuff. Really, like, gets it. It's just a nice dude.
Did you ask to come?
Okay, nice.
Are you coming to lunch too?
Yeah.
So you are?
Yeah.
And
Maybe there's another.
Thomas.
I'll let you guys get to lunch and I'll see you this
See you later.
afternoon, yeah, and then we'll have. a
Nice
chat.
to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I'm taking you to lunch.
Okay,
With the-
good.
With the crew.
Hello, nice to meet you. My hands are kind of sweaty.
Oh, sorry, that's okay.
Hi, I'm Calista. Actually, emailed you a while ago. I was applying to grad school.
Okay, did I respond to you? or-
Did.
Oh, yeah, and you got into Brown.
Yes.
Oh, you were neuroscience.
Yeah.
Okay. And where are you going? And
Here.
where you're staying? here?
I'm saying.
You're spending a lot of time in Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah, I like it.
Yeah, it's pretty good, actually. It's nice.
Hi,
It's-
what's your name? Nice to meet you.
I go by things as well. Yeah.
Yes, I guess you're a grad student.
J.I.
Or, I'm an RA right now, but
You're not,
sorry.
you'll be starting.
J.
in what lab?
Wait for
Yeah.
Emily.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
We can get going.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Emily went to the bathroom, but.
Bye, Mitri. So where,
I'm working in neurosurgery right now, like a few other people, and my main project right now is on visual cognition.
oh, really?
So I'm setting up my first.
You saw the light? You're going to vision now?
Yeah.
Well, good, it's good seeing you.
Yeah.
Good to see you as well.
Say hi to Chris Moore.
Okay, I will.